Hello and welcome to the Better Man Clinics, the podcast where we talk to actual experts to address the questions that men want answered, but are either too embarrassed to ask or simply don't know who to ask. Before we get started, I do want to caution that the conversations on this podcast are for informational purposes only. They don't represent the medical consultation, nor do they present medical advice to individuals. Rather, we hope that the podcast empowers men with the knowledge and confidence to address these issues with their healthcare providers. As with any medical or wellness issues, you should always consult with your healthcare provider before beginning any type of treatment or preventative intervention. With that being said, in this episode, we discuss plant-based diets. Now, plant-based diets are being praised for health benefits ranging from weight loss to heart health to even cancer prevention. But what exactly constitutes a plant-based diet? Can any animal products be included? Are there any risks to only consuming plant-based foods? Do you need to make any adjustments with supplements? And is a plant-based diet something that guys can stick with for the long haul? To help us answer these questions and many more, we turn to an expert in plant-based diets. Julieanna Hever is a registered dietitian and a certified personal trainer. She has authored 6 books, including The Healthspan Solution, The Idiot's Guides to Plant-Based Nutrition, and The Vegiterranean Diet, as well as 2 peer-reviewed journal articles on plant-based nutrition for healthcare professionals. Her latest book, The Choose You Now Diet, is due to be published this month. She is also the host of the Choose You Now podcast, has given a TEDx talk, and has served as an instructor for the Cornell Plant-Based Nutrition Certification Program. She's also appeared on shows such as Dr. Oz, Harry, and the Steve Harvey Show. And now, I bring you our conversation with Julieanna Hever about plant-based diets. Hello, and welcome to the Better Man Clinics. Today, we're going to be talking about plant-based diet, an approach to nutrition that's recently garnered a lot of favorable reviews, if you will, a lot of great press in the news, and a lot of awards and accolades in the sense that this plant-based diet has been shown to be very beneficial with respect of weight loss, beneficial with respect from heart health, and even beneficial from the standpoint of cancer prevention. So when guys hear this on the news or on social media, inevitable questions come up, such as, what is this all about? What does a plant-based diet even mean? Is it right for me? What are the risks involved? And do you think I could stick with it? To help us answer these questions and many more, we're fortunate to have a true expert on the podcast with us today. Julieanna Hever is not only a registered dietitian, she's also an expert on plant-based diet. Julieanna, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And as we chatted a little bit before recording, one thing that guys know very little about, generally speaking, of course, is nutrition. And so this is going to be enlightening for everyone, including myself. I'll be the first to admit my knowledge base is limited. So before we dive into the topic of plant-based diets, I'd love to know a little bit about you, specifically kind of what drove your passion for nutrition, and specifically to become really, if you will, an evangelist for plant-based diets.
Well, I want to applaud you for asking these questions and for acknowledging that so many people don't know about nutrition, because I always say everybody eats, so everyone is an expert on what you're supposed to eat. And that is why there is so much confusion and misinformation out there. So I applaud you for diving deep, and I'm excited for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And I could say that my journey is like a conclusion of a whole host of a confluence of different events that took place. I grew up in Los Angeles, so I started, dancing before I could walk, according to my mother. Mm-hmm. And I remember my new book is coming out next month. It's called The Choose You Now Diet, and I kind of talk about my personal story. This is the book I've always wanted to write, but I talk about how when I was in dance class and I was going through the changes at like 10, 11 years old, and my dance teacher called me out and told me to cut out my snacks in front of all my fellow dancers. So that started part of my passion for nutrition and diet and wellness and all of that. And that just kept proceeding throughout my life. I just kept learning about it and reading about it. And I stumbled upon a book when I was a teenager called Diet for a New America by John Robbins. Mm-hmm. And in this brilliant book. It was like, it blew my mind because it connected food to health and the environment and animal agriculture, and it put all of it together in this really compelling way. And I didn't know any of this stuff. I mean, granted, this was before the internet was, accessible, and it was before this information was really out there, but it really struck a chord in me. And I decided I did not want to participate in this. I was like, okay, so I will not eat animal products, but I didn't know what that meant. So I proceeded to, say no to the main dish that my mother was preparing and eat the side dishes, or maybe eat some granola bars and fruit rolls, like not the healthiest of diets, but I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't cook yet. My parents did their due diligence and they were concerned, and they staged what I like to refer to as my intervention, where they took me to a steakhouse with their friend Kendra, the nurse. And we ordered a teriyaki steak with a pineapple ring on top. And Kendra proceeded to tell me how I'm going to be deficient in protein and iron. And she scared me back into eating right back in there. But I remember that first bite. I write about this in one of my last books, about that first bite. Once you know, you can't unknow. Mm-hmm. And I remember taking that first bite, but of course I was socialized right back into what we're socialized into believing about food. But I always wondered, those vegetarians aren't just dying off. We're not hearing news reports.
Certainly not.
Those sickly vegetarians. So I kept pursuing it. I was still more interested. And then I was an actress, because a lot of people in Los Angeles are actresses. And I was pursuing that for a little while. And while I was doing that, it came up, Julieanna, cut out your snacks, for whatever TV camera, whatever. And so I went back to that, and I was actually paired up with a personal trainer. So I started personal training and fell in love. Because, by the way, back up to when I was 5 years old, and I had cassette tapes of me teaching my sister and my friends aerobics classes. So I've always loved fitness. So I decided to become a personal trainer. And while I was acting, but as soon as I started personal training, everyone was asking me about nutrition. And I was like, I've studied my whole life, and I've read a chapter in the personal training handbook about nutrition, but that wasn't adequate for me. I wanted to know why. And I wanted to know the deep dive science reasons for why I would recommend anything. So I quickly enrolled in graduate school. I got into Cal State Northridge and had this amazing pursuit of my master's in nutrition, and became a registered dietitian. And fast forward, a long story made longer. When I got to the end of that, when you get that, you get the ability to dive into the statistics and look at the research and look at the biochemistry and the physiology. And that was it. It was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I just had my baby, my daughter, and I tried it, and I transitioned myself to a plant-based diet, and I reversed chronic, long, things I could not get rid of my entire life, like long-term GI problems that no doctor ever asked me what I ate. I was finally gone. And my acne, I had acne for so long, and gone. And I was like, wow, there's really something to this. And my labs were amazing. And then I just couldn't stop talking about it. So I was teaching it with my clients, and I started to just see what I now say results are typical, because people would get off their medication, something that you and I were not taught in graduate school, that people can get off these medications. People reversing chronic conditions, things I never expected to see, I was witnessing. So that was it. I started writing books and speaking around the world. And I just cannot tell you how many extraordinary things I've seen over the last 17 years.
That's amazing. What an amazing story. It says, I love the evolution there, into it. It's not just I'm going to be a plant-based dietitian. That's what I'm going to do today. It's really a great journey. And again, that built up passion that you have for it is palpable, and it's really, really exciting. And it's obvious you care so much about this, and which helps for everyone watching and viewing and listening, because it's more meaningful for sure. So diving into plant-based diets, we're going to start as I always say, my colleague in medical school, who would always sit in the second row, and whenever we had a lecture, he'd raise his hand and he'd say, Professor, just the basics. I need to know the basics. What are the basics? So we're gonna level set and say everyone knows what plants are, but what is a plant-based diet? So we're all on the same page.
Well, I don't think we can be all on the same page exactly. I think you can't define a certain diet, because there's no official way of defining it. But when I wrote my first book, and what I've continued to do over this is my 7th book now, is to define it this way. I took I was supposed to write the Complete Idiot's Guide to Vegan Nutrition. I was hired to write that book. I petitioned to change it to a Complete Idiot's Guide to Plant-Based Nutrition because this was all changing at this time. You know, T. Colin Campbell had just defined whole food plant-based, and people were talking about it more and more. And that's when Bill Clinton changed his diet and reversed his cardiovascular disease by working with Dr. Esselstyn and Dr. Dean Ornish. And they were saying plant-based. So it became a thing. In fact, I just got I'm now officially trademarked as the plant-based dietitian because it wasn't even a thing back then.
Nice.
But I wanted to change the title because a vegan diet is an exclusive definition. It means I do not eat animal products, but that could mean anything, especially now. The landscape has changed remarkably. Right now, anything you could eat, I could eat vegan. And so it's changed so that we really can't define it. So I like to say I eat a diet of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices in infinite tasty combinations. And even within those parameters, there are still different ways to interpret that. Like you could do a plant-based keto. So I really kind of try to get away from the labeling. But what I mean by a plant-based diet is that you're eating a diet based on whole plants. And optimally for nutrition, you're highlighting whole foods and you are getting a variety. And I use a way of a mnemonic called the 6 daily threes of foods that you prioritize, which I'm happy to go into because of their nutritional uniqueness, the things that you can't get elsewhere that should be prioritized in the diet to get an optimal nutritional profile.
Got it. So let's unpack that a little bit. So in terms of, you said something very important. You said that, you know what, you want to eat the good plant-based foods, because one thing that comes up in terms of plant-based is that you're quote unquote eating plants, but you're not necessarily eating healthy, right? I have spoken to another dietitian a few weeks ago, and he had mentioned, like, for instance, not all plants are good. Like, for instance, really starchy plants are high in glucose, right? And they're not great, even though they might be plant-based to have in large quantities. So maybe break down for us in terms of kind of when you think about plant-based, like, is there good versus bad in your mind?
Well, I beg to disagree with that dietitian. And I would say,
there you go. It's interesting.
And I would also like to change the question a little bit, if you don't mind. I didn't say good because I don't like to put foods as good or bad. I do like to say whole food. Okay. Because it's anytime you derive a food, you take a food and you refine it. Like you take, let's say, the whole wheat grain, and then you take out some of the fiber and you end up with a white flour, and you keep, as you process this down the line, you're deleting fiber, so important. You're deleting nutrition, so important. So staying as close to the intact whole form is optimal. There's nothing wrong with, in the research, in eating starch. If you look around the world, most cultures base their diets on starch from way back when, rice in Asia and potatoes in Peru and South America. And I mean, we've been eating maize and corn. There's been starch-based diets throughout history, and people have thrived by eating that. It's only when we started introducing refined foods and animal foods at the levels that we're consuming them now that we started to see this insane jump in obesity and chronic disease. So I define a healthy food, a wholesome diet, based on the whole version of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices in infinite tasty combinations, because there's so many delicious ways to eat them.
So I'm getting hungry just thinking about that. The question I have then is, we're talking about whole foods, then whole plant-based foods. What is the theory or concept behind that in terms of why that specifically is healthy versus everything else may not be, or like meats or meat-based products? What is the theory, like the fundamental nutrition theory behind why that's healthy or part of a healthy diet?
Oh, we might talk for hours on this subject, but I'll distill it. Yeah, you're getting me revved up. I will distill it into two things. First of all, it's what you are eating, and it's what you're replacing. There's two components to this. So let's start with the negative, the bad news first. Animal products have compounds in them. They're high in saturated fat, dietary cholesterol, heme iron, new 5-GC, carnitine and choline, which convert in the gut microbiome to TMAO. All these compounds that promote the disease process. And as a physician, like disease basically all starts with inflammation and oxidation, right? Those ingredients are, even when you cook animal products, which we have to do, so we avoid foodborne illness, you're ending up with things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and all these things that happen when you cook flesh that are also carcinogenic and inflammatory. So what you're taking out of the diet is really part of why it's so healthy. The other reason, the good news is, and This is my mission in my work right now. It's been for years. I want to change the language of food so bad. The reason we are so confused is something I call macro confusion. And I would love to get into that after, but just suffice it to say for this purpose, we don't eat protein, carbs, and fat. And it is confusing people so much that we don't even know what we're supposed to eat, even at a researcher physician level. It's like, I'll talk about that. So instead of thinking about food as protein, carbs, and fat, I would rather people think of trying to get more phytonutrients and fiber. Those are, in my estimation, based on the preponderance level literature, the most important things you can consume. Phytonutrients are anti-inflammatory, antioxidative, antimicrobial, cardioprotective, so incredibly powerful. You only get those two compounds from plants. They are exclusive to plant foods. So that's one part of it. The other part is as you refine those foods into the processed foods that we're seeing an abundance of now, and I include in that category refined sugar and oils. Those are refined out, distilled from the original form. You're losing those phytonutrients and fiber. And we're all walking around really not deficient in protein, like many people are afraid of, but really deficient, if you will, it's not really said this way, in phytonutrients and fiber, which are the things that we see associated with all of these incredible health benefits that are really abundant in the literature.
That was a great way of explaining it. So again, you're taking away the bad stuff. And again, there's been a lot of press lately about inflammatory diets and how that leads to cancer and heart disease, et cetera. So you're removing some of that by taking away the meat-based food that again have to be cooked and released, whatnot. And then you're adding the good stuff, right? Which is fiber and phytonutrients. Now, I think most people are familiar with fiber. Can you give us an example of what a phytonutrient is?
Yeah, it's basically an overall category of plant-derived nutrition. And really people say phytochemicals, but I like to think of it as nutrients because they're so beneficial. Sure. So every color of the rainbow, I tell people to eat every color of the rainbow every day. I'm wearing my leafy green shirt because I want everyone to eat their leafy greens every day. I autograph all my books in a green Sharpie and I sign with leafy green love because it's so important. But let's talk about that, for instance, leafy greens. Chlorophyll is a phytonutrient. It's the compound that makes the green color that we see everywhere in nature. Well, not so much in LA with all of our dehydrated plants, unfortunately. But the green itself has very powerful anti-inflammatory compounds. And of course, people go, oh, great, I'm going to distill it and make a chlorophyll dropper and you could take it directly and concentrate and isolate it. But really, why not consume it in your everyday diet?
Exactly, right.
That's one example. And then carotenoids is a whole huge class of phytonutrients that are found in the reds and oranges and yellows, the fruits and vegetables. And also they're actually in the leafy green stuff, but hidden because chlorophyll dominates the color palette on those foods. But those carotenoids are incredible for immune health and for prostate health and for eye health and all that. So all of these different compounds have a plethora of beautiful synergistic effects that they have on our human body once we consume them. Because it's kind of like that concept of hormesis, right? Plants have to live in nature and they have to deal with weather and pests and temperature changes and all that stuff. And they grow these compounds to protect themselves. Fortunately, there's this beautiful synergistic effect, like our bodies are so magnificent that we can consume these powerful phytonutrients and we gauge similar benefits in our body as well. So magic.
That's really a fantastic explanation. Now, guys are listening to this and are saying, Julieanna's onto something. This sounds good. I'm ready to sign with my green Sharpie and sign up on the bottom line. But I have questions, right? So, this sounds good, but what about do I have to get rid of all animal products? Is there no exceptions? Can I still maybe have some eggs periodically? Can I drink milk? In your vision, Julieanna, of a plant-based diet, are any of those things included, or is it truly just the things you mentioned?
Again, there's no food police, and I don't want to be the food police. People always want me to be the food police. Not you, but I mean, everyone, my friends and family, when they're sitting with me, oh, is it okay if I eat this? I'm like, you do you. I stop trying to convince anyone. I'm like, you do your thing. I'm doing my thing. And ideally you're eating mostly plants, but where are you? My clients that come to me, I will start where they're at. I will not try to convince someone to eat this way. I'm not going to try to convince your listeners to eat this way because, hey, if you want to eat keto, there are plenty of dietitians that are going to help you out. There's plenty of thinking on all sorts of ways of eating. I will help you eat more plants. And then what happens is that you see the difference and all of a sudden your labs get better and you have all this energy and you feel like you could, all sorts of beautiful things. Like I said, I've seen over these 17 years that are just, they're kind of mind blowing, but at the same time, now I could confidently say results are typical. It would take, I don't know what it would take to unseat my what I've seen and like to change my thinking. So I won't try to convince anyone. So if you need to have, a piece of fish a couple times a week to make it doable for you, and you're still eating all these whole plant foods, and you're getting your legumes and your nuts and seeds and your, vegetables and fruits, that's going to be so much better than compared to a standard Western diet. So it's compared to what is the question not asked often enough.
It makes sense. So basically what you're saying here is this is not a binary, right? You just don't go from zero to plant. You don't need to go from zero to plant immediately. You can, but for those people who feel like, wait, I love it, but I'm not sure I can just go whole hog here. No, definitely not hog, like plant-based hog. Into this, they can do it gradually, potentially.
Well, there's two types of personalities. There's those that want to do it cold tofu. They dive in, they're the all or nothing type of personality. But then there's also the people that need to stepwise in. I was one that stepwise in myself. Mm-hmm. And the research seems to show that those that stepwise in are the most sustainable. So that's kind of an interesting food for thought, but it depends on you. If you want to go all in, I would say do your homework and make sure you know what you're doing so that you don't have any, reverberations or you couldn't just dive in and learn as you go. But I recommend getting as much information at the get-go but do it for your personality. If you want to go all in, go all in. If you want to stepwise into it, stepwise into it. There is no perfect way. I mean, I think a lot of people that come to me potentially, I work with clients one-on-one around the world. That's what my day job. Mm-hmm. And the people that get a recent diagnosis that's really scary, those are the ones that, or they had just recently lost someone or seeing a loved one go through something traumatizing. Those are the ones that's easier to dive in because they're so motivated. So it depends on where you're coming from, but I would never say you have to do it a certain way. And I never want perfection to be the obstacle of progress.
No, that's a great way to put it. Now, one other thing I'm going to throw in there, because guys, they're always going to ask this stuff. How does coffee, tea, and alcohol fit into this diet? Because some diets say you have to cut things out or whatnot. Does this have any impact on it?
It's tea, right? I'm drinking my tea. Yes, I'm drinking my mushroom hibiscus green tea that I'm obsessed with.
Nice.
But I will say this: it's not really necessarily you can't do alcohol, coffee, or tea, or you have to do alcohol, coffee, and tea. I wrote about alcohol in the Vegiterranean Diet because my goal with that book was to assess why the Mediterranean diet gets all of the love in the literature. It's always like US diet's best. It does. And I dove in, and it's not because of the red wine, the fish, and the olive oil. That was what my thesis is in that book. It's because the classic Mediterranean diet is a whole food plant-based diet traditionally, but it's not anymore. So that's a whole other talk. So, but it wasn't the red wine, and we'd have to have about 1,000 bottles of red wine to get the resveratrol that would give it the benefit. Yeah. But is there room in the diet for a little wine? Probably, yes. I go by the same standards as, the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco, whatever it is that they say 1 serving for women max a day, 2 for men a day, just in terms of health, because we know it's carcinogenic and it's, it's toxin to the body. Yeah. But I enjoy wine like anyone, or not everyone, but, and then coffee and tea are interesting. There's a lot of benefits to coffee and tea. Okay. Unless you've got some sensitivity to caffeine, and then you have to be mindful of that, but there's still a whole host of caffeine free or low caffeine teas and coffees. So sure. I'm a big advocate. I drink coffee mostly. I drink tea every day, throughout the day. I start with my black tea and I go to my caffeine free, this kind of tea later in the day. And I drink coffee sometimes, but the benefits seem really clear unless you have a sensitivity to caffeine or some kind of cardiovascular situation where you need to avoid it. But it really has nothing much to do with the plant-based diet.
Great. I mean, that's actually reassuring, because a lot of guys, that could be a showstopper, if they have to not drink their tea or coffee or whatnot. Now, I'm gonna throw a roadblock your way, and I'm gonna repeat a question that somebody asked you when you were younger and you decided to go vegetarian, which is, okay, this is all great, but this is not really a balanced diet, is it? I mean, I go back to when I was in health class, right? There was always that plate they gave you that broken up and say, okay, here are your carbs, and here's your protein, and here's your fats and whatnot, and there's always some meat on that, or maybe dairy products or something on there. So the natural assumption is, if you remove those meat products, you're no longer eating a balanced diet. What is your response to that? What are your thoughts on that?
The thing that broke my mind was when I was in graduate school and I walked into my first conference for it was the American Dietetic Association at the time, and now it's Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And I walked into the expo center and I saw the hugest Dairy Council booth, and then the Coca-Cola booth, and then this. And I finally realized, I noticed on the handouts that told me you need to recommend 3 servings of dairy a day, that the fine print at the bottom said sponsored by the Dairy Council. So basically they paid a lot of money to have that positioning in the food pyramids. And I've read a lot about that since. So there's that. There's definitely marketing involved. It's a very expensive political stance as well. Mm-hmm. That said, putting that aside and ignoring recommendations, for instance, you can absolutely have a health promoting balanced diet without animals. There's no question. You have to be mindful, but I think with any diet, you need to be mindful. Everything should be conscientious. If you're out there, I have this great meme it wasn't mine, but I think it's so funny. These girls are sitting there eating McDonald's, burgers and fries and milkshakes, and the girl next door is eating the healthy salad, and they're like, oh, but a vegan diet, where are you going to get your protein or whatever? Right. It's like, compared to what, again, is a question not asked often enough. You can absolutely do it healthfully, and you will get benefits if you're mindful and you do your homework and you mind them. There are some notable nutrients, like with any diet, that you need to be aware of. Like B12 is really important on a vegan diet. We need to make sure that you're getting a source of B12. So if you're mindful and you do your homework, absolutely, you can get everything you need in a very strategic way. And then again, the benefits show that that's true. The long-term benefits, the short-term benefits, just kind of validate all of that.
That's perfect. Actually, that's a good segue into, risks and, making up for things that you may not get, right? So I want to just bring up some, again, this is not coming from me, this is coming from Dr. Google, where, a quick internet search and you come up with things like, okay, what are the concerns, let's say, of plant-based diet? I want to name a few, and I just want to get your thoughts about potentially, A, is this a real concern? And B, if it is, what can you do from a plant-based diet perspective to circumvent those concerns or adjust for them? So the first one that came up was anemia. And I think you mentioned before in your steakhouse analogy, like, oh, where are you going to get your iron from, right? So tell us a little bit about the concern for anemia and how you can overcome that with a plant-based diet.
Well, first, to alleviate the concern, because vegan diets and omnivore diets, there's no increase in incidence of iron deficiency anemia in vegans.
Okay.
Interestingly, right?
Right.
Yeah. And if you break it down, in a omnivorous diet from meat, you're getting iron from a heme iron source. That's where you get in animal products. It's heme iron. And then on a plant-based diet, we're getting it from non-heme iron. So it's a slightly different compound. However, the twist on this is that heme iron is better absorbed. So I cannot tell you how many people come to me and say, I'm anemic and my doctor told me I need to eat steak. I mean, that's what the doctor defaults to because that's what they were taught in medical school. Sure. And just because it's absorbed well doesn't mean it's good. Not just because something is good doesn't mean more is better. And that's a big lesson I had to learn in my career. Same with protein. So what we found now with heme iron, the newer research is showing, not even new, there's a lot of research on this, that heme iron, because it's so potent, it actually has a pro-oxidative effect in the body. So because of that, we're seeing associations with chronic disease processes because it's so well absorbed. It's such a high potent type of molecule. Mm-hmm. So you're better off getting it from non-heme iron. Now, with any diet, a good way to avoid deficiency is to make sure you're getting foods high in iron. And I'll just talk about a plant-based diet. Yeah. Leafy greens, again, the leafy greens and legumes are great sources of iron. And then what helps is pairing those foods with foods that are high in vitamin C or absorbic acid. So basically, if you have your spinach, sprinkle a little lemon on there or some balsamic vinegar, or if you're having a bean burrito, put some salsa on there to get the vitamin C from the tomatoes. And there's this beautiful, again, the body is so gorgeously complex. There's a synergistic response between the vitamin C and it helps enhance the absorption of the iron. Similarly, on the other side of that, you want to avoid consuming, that's where coffee and tea could come in, by the way. So you want to separate your coffee and tea from your meals or from your supplements, because that will kind of inhibit some of the absorption of some of those nutrients. So just being mindful of getting those foods and separating coffees and teas and stuff like that. And you're not going to have an increased incidence of iron deficiency anemia.
Got it. What about, again, another thing you mentioned was in the McDonald's analogy, protein deficiency. Like, oh, well, I'm not going to get any protein. And that's really important. Is there any validation there in terms of protein deficiency on plant-based diet? And how do you get protein from a plant-based diet?
there's this relentless pursuit of protein in the world. I mean, from everyone. It's the conversation that will not go away. And this is where the protein, carbs, and fat thing, the macro confusion idea that I'm so passionately trying to scream to the world in a gentle way. I just think this will change the world if we stop talking about this stuff. We don't eat protein. You know, meat is not just protein, it's meat. It's not synonymous. And we eat whatever source of protein, and then we break it down into dipeptides and ultimately to amino acids. And that's what we need. We just need a few essential amino acids from our diet that we can't produce. And then we create all the rest in our body. So our body is incredibly efficient. We pool those amino acids and then we string it back together when we need to create a fingernail or an organ tissue or whatever it is. And, but our body's incredibly efficient. So if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet and you're prioritizing the 6 daily threes, you're getting your legumes and you're getting your nuts and seeds, you're getting a variety of the other plant foods, you're getting all those amino acids that you need. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, too, my research has expanded. My last book was called The Healthspan Solution, and that came out 2019. And the healthspan and longevity research, the only dietary way they've ever increased healthspan and longevity in the literature is with dietary restriction without malnutrition, specifically dietary essential amino acid restriction. So less, maybe more when it comes to protein. So slamming those protein, look at those people that are slamming the protein and, you know, they get bigger, but growth hormone, we don't want growth hormone and IGF-1 to be boosted when we get older. What does that mean, right? That's increasing your cancer risk, all of that. So there's a lot of reasons to not be so amped up about getting enough. First of all, you're going to get enough, but to get more and more and more. Even I work with a lot of athletes. I work with elite athletes. I work with all sorts of people in all populations. Now, granted, when you get into the senior years, I think it's over 65, the most current research shows you need to be mindful of your amino acid intake. But again, you could absolutely get plenty of amino acids from plants.
And again, you had mentioned some examples of high sources of amino acids would be like beans, nuts, those kind of things would be kind of the top for protein / amino acid.
Yes. And again, if I say this, it doesn't mean you need to tons of this. So those are 2 of my 6 daily threes. One is the legume category. So that's lentils, peas, beans, hummus should be a food group, and soy foods. Mm-hmm. And then that's about 1 to 1.5 cups a day. And then nuts and seeds, 1 to 2 ounces a day. You're going to get plenty. There's protein in romaine lettuce, believe it or not.
Wow, and that I wouldn't imagine, but no, that's interesting. That's very interesting. And you also mentioned vitamins. So you mentioned B12, which I came across. I also came across zinc. I'm assuming you can get those from other sources as well.
I call them the notable nutrients, and there are 5 notable nutrients that you need to be mindful of on a plant-based diet. And again, no matter what diet you're on, you're going to have to be mindful of some nutrients. If you're on the keto diet, you'd have to be mindful of fiber and folate and vitamin C, for instance. On a plant-based diet, you need to be mindful of vitamins B12, D, and K2, iodine and zinc, the minerals, and then the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA. So do you want me to go through each of them?
Please.
Okay, so B12 is a nutrient found in the soil, and the animals consume them, or the ruminant animals produce it. And that's where people get it from. And so I always call it the most finicky vitamin with an attitude problem, because it has this weird logarithmic absorption curve as well. And because our body can store it for up to a period of time. But the only source of it on a plant-based diet would be in fortified foods. And because I want people to prioritize whole foods and to minimize the fortified foods, like I use, for example, plant milk that's fortified or nutritional yeast as ingredients. I don't want you to be pounding plant milks to get this. The problem with B12 is that you're going to run out at some point. And because you will be asymptomatic usually and until it's too late. And because of the potential risk for irreversible neurological deficiency, I beg the vegans out there to make sure the cheapest, easiest, most convenient, safest way to avoid that is just to supplement. And it's, it's a water soluble nutrient. So you don't have to worry about toxicity. I don't know if there's any known cases of B12 toxicity. You have to try really hard. So supplementing with B12 is very important on a plant-based diet. And a lot of vegans are deficient because they think, oh, I'm on a healthy diet, I don't need to. Not true. Nothing is perfect. Vitamin D is different because it's not specific for a plant-based diet, but we're still at risk just like anyone else, because now we're seeing this global, quote unquote, worldwide deficiency of D. Yeah. But it's a fat soluble nutrient. We're supposed to get it from the sun, but a lot of us are staying indoors because, well, for a lot of reasons, like last year and a half, but our skin is supposed to be exposed to UVB rays at the top of the day, and then you go through the liver and kidneys, you get this active vitamin D, but a lot of us avoid the sun. A lot of us don't live in where we live, where we get the great latitude and the sunshine 355 days a year.
Exactly.
But even still, even my clients here in LA or Southern California still have vitamin D deficiency common. Obesity gets in the way, like excess fat on the skin can inhibit the absorption. There's all these different factors. People wear sunscreen. So all these different factors come into play. So what I do, instead of blindly recommending supplements for D because it's fat soluble and you can be toxic in it, I have my clients ask their physicians for a D serum test. And then you could decide if you need to try sun therapy or try supplementing to make sure you're replenishing your D.
Got it. And you supplement through, like, is it vitamin you can take it by mouth, or is that like an injection or something?
A vitamin D would be oral.
Got it.
B12 you can get injections, by the way, or you could just do a supplement.
Got it. So what were the other ones that you were going to go through?
Vitamin K2, I'm still on the fence about, but there's some compelling evidence that we get plenty of K1 from our leafy green veggies, again, those leafy greens, but K2 is menaquinone, and it's a different form. It's like a bacterial form of K2. And can we retroconvert? I think possibly, but there's some evidence that it may be beneficial for our bone health and cardiovascular health to supplement with K2. So I do take a supplement with all of these nutrients that I talk about. They're all in one multi, just to cover the bases. And that's what I suggest to my clients. And then the two minerals are iodine. And interestingly, iodine, the reason we iodized salt way back when was because people weren't getting it enough. It depends on the soil and depends on your proximity to the ocean, all of that. And nowadays people are avoiding salt for hypertension, or they're using fancy salts, these gourmet salts out there. So they're not getting iodized salt. And I'm seeing like goiters and stuff come back like I hadn't expected to see. And I'm thinking that's part of why, because we need iodine for thyroid function. So something to be mindful of. Adults need 150 micrograms a day. And so I have that in my supplement as well. You could use iodized salt or sea vegetables, but that's not always, convenient for everyone. And then the last one is zinc. The last micronutrient is zinc. And zinc is found in nuts and seeds and legumes, but because it's located also with these phytate compounds, these compounds that kind of inhibit absorption, we need to consume more of those foods to get enough zinc. And or you can consider supplementing too, because it plays a really important role in immune function, which is top of people's attentions today. And then the last nutrient is a macronutrient category that people need to be mindful of on a plant-based diet. And that's the long chain omega-3 fatty acids. So the EPA and DHA. So we can take in ALA, alpha linolenic acid, from things like flax seeds, chia seed, hemp seed, tofu, and walnuts. And then our body has to convert it into a longer molecule, into the eicosapentaenoic acid, EPA, and then further elongate it into docosahexaenoic acid, DHA. However, they found when they sampled vegans' bloods that we don't actually elongate as much. We don't have as high a level as fish eaters that are getting the direct source. Yeah. Does it matter? We don't know if it matters. We don't know yet, because we're seeing decreased risk for cardiovascular disease, cognitive function, prostate cancer in people on a plant-based diet, which are the things that are associated mostly with those nutrients. So we don't know. So I do have my clients, if they want supplement, I supplement sometimes with a microalgae form of EPA and DHA just in case, but that's more on the fence.
No, I'm so glad you went through this, because again, it's, it's always good to say, yeah, well, this is great. This is a fantastic diet. It has no limits and, no restriction or not, but this is important. It's important that even on the healthiest diet, you need to know what the limitations are. And as long as you make up for them, you should be in good shape. And this was very informative in terms of specifically how to compensate for any deficiencies within a plant-based diet, which is very helpful. Now, that being said, do you ever run across a client or potential client or friend who might be interested in a plant-based diet, who you say, you know what, this is just not for you. It's really not a good idea for you specifically to be a plant-based diet. Does that person even exist?
Well, again, I don't try to convert anyone anymore. That just made me bang my head against the wall and wonder why I wasn't being so effective. So I stopped with that. I think if you want it, you can make it work. That's what I've learned. If you really want to do it, you can make it happen. It's just a matter of being mindful and strategic about what you're eating and when you're eating and how you're feeling, and looking at your lab work and being analytical and objective about it.
Got it. So there's no medical conditions that you have to be specifically worried about in terms of plant-based diet. I
have yet to see one.
Perfect. No, that's fair. For some, like for keto, there are, there really are. So that's, it just depends. And I just wanted to make sure, just again, from the standpoint.
I would flip it and say that there's no one that the keto diet is good for.
There you go. That's a perspective as well, right? But definitely people who they definitely should not be on it. That's for sure. That finally, in terms of from the standpoint of potential negatives, have you noticed people who just, let's say they go, you said cold tofu, right? They go cold tofu into a plant-based diet. Is there like some kind of adjustment there where they might not be feeling well, they might have gastrointestinal upset, anything like that from a really sharp adjustment into a plant-based diet?
It's a great question. And yes, you probably will. I see a lot of clients, it depends on where you're coming from, like where's your starting point? Most of my clients that come to me, well, I work with all sorts of clients that have already been plant-based that need to fine tune up to the people eating a standard Western diet and just starting out. The more extreme to the unhealthier version of a standard diet you're eating, you'll see likely a lot of people have like quote unquote detoxification symptoms, like the first few days, fatigue, headaches, stuff you would see for any kind of detoxification, because food is very potent. And a lot of those really hyper palatable foods that are sugary, oily, salty, fatty are, they hit your dopamine and they light up your brain, and they're very powerful. There's casomorphines that make it addictive, like dairy products are addictive in a way that are similar to like opiates. So not to the extent, obviously, but they're similar impact. So yes, a lot of people feel that. Some people do not, but most people, depending on where you're coming from. The other thing that I think most people experience is you're going from very low fiber. It's 97% of the US population gets the minimum recommended fiber intake, which is so little anyway. And then you're eating plants, which have fiber. You're going to feel it in your GI tract. So your microbiome needs to shift, and it will shift. It's unbelievable how powerful that is, but it takes time. And so expect some GI upset. A lot of people get a lot of gas and bloating, totally normal. So that is one benefit of stepwising into it, but also just knowing that there's certain foods that could be worse on that, like the legumes and cruciferous vegetables seem to have the most effect on the microbiome exploding kind of a thing. It's not really what's happening, but like just having the impact. But you're definitely going to see shifts in your microbiome and your GI feeling and function and bowel up movements and all of that. So be prepared for that and stay the course. And, you could do all the other things like eating slowly, chewing well, giving yourself time in the fasted state. I think that's really important. I do incorporate time restricted feeding with my clients because it's so helpful to have that time off to do all that repair and rejuvenation that we need to do when we're not spending all that energy digesting and absorbing, and stuff like, not using a straw or carbonated drinks and stuff, that all the bubbles, those are other things that promote gas and bloating too. But just assume that it's going to be likely that you're going to experience some of that.
How long does that usually last for, did you say?
Depends on where you're coming from. It depends on what you're eating. It depends, so many variables. It's impossible to say. It could be months for some people. I have people that have been vegan for a long time, and they're like, why am I suddenly getting, in fact, I just had a client today that she wants to work with me about that. Like, she's like, why all of a sudden? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tease out a food and symptom journal, and we're going to see what is associated with it. So it could change. What's interesting about like immunology, which I don't think anyone really fully understands immunology, look at our current crisis, is that I see so many people with allergies, myself included. I went through this whole phase where I had all these allergies, but it was like the foods I was eating the most of. So if you take them out and then bring them back in, your immune system seems to adjust. So I think the immune system is far more complicated than we really understand.
It makes sense. Now, when you're structuring these plant-based diets, when you're getting people on plant-based diet, does portion control play a big role as well, or not as much?
I do not count or calculate calories, macros, none of that. I say, eat these foods, prioritize the 6 daily 3, listen to your body. My new book is all about these mindfulness applications that have evolved in my years of conversation, these dialogues I've had with hundreds of clients. Because no matter what I tell you to eat, and that's all in my books, here's how to eat, here's what to eat. The psychosocial components that come into play with food are so deeply intertwined in every moment of every decision that we make about food, all these stories, that I'm trying to bring back mindfulness and like eating when you're truly hungry. And I have like ways to think about how, when you're like to figure out when you're truly hungry, and then to feel satisfied, like to eat when you feel just satisfied and to stop. But the psychosocial cues around us are way even more powerful than just the food that we're eating itself. It's crazy. It's think about it. We live in this world that's surrounded by, like, that's what my TEDx talk is about. It's like we break bread, we celebrate, we mourn, we entertain. Everything is surrounding food, and we have all these stories surrounding it. So Portion control is just an exogenous tool people use to measure, but I'd rather when you're hungry and learn to assess the stuff from within, because the people that are naturally healthier or naturally lean tend to self-regulate because they haven't been socialized out of that instinct.
Right. No, actually, I love that. I mean, portion control is very difficult for a lot of people, and just kind of limiting and trying to figure it all out, it just becomes very, very difficult to do. Now, a lot of guys are saying, again, this sounds really great, but I can't picture 3 solid meals a day or 2 meals a day on plant-based. Like, what do you have for breakfast? How does that work? Can you give us an example, like, of a day in the life of someone on a plant-based diet, like what that might look like?
Sure. Let me preface that by saying that we're all mostly creatures of habit. Most of us rotate between 1 or 2 breakfasts, 3 or 4 lunches, 5 or 6 dinners every week, and then we repeat. So really all you need to find are like 10 recipes that you love. And then I would say to go back to what you already may be eating that's plant-based, but you never really thought about it as plant-based, like oatmeal or pasta primavera or veggie sushi, like things that we've been eating throughout our life that just, oh yeah, it happens to be plant-based. So, but for an example, oatmeal for breakfast with berries and a sprinkle of flax seeds and some maple syrup drizzled on, or some whatever kind of fruits you love. And then for lunch, a big, huge shock and awe salad with some legumes and some cooked veggies and some delicious, I do a nut or seed-based dressing that's like creamy and delicious. I love dressings and sauces. That's a secret way to get people to eat more veggies, is a good sauce or dressing. Yeah. And then dinner could be anything you could eat. You could, whatever, lasagna. I mean, I just published my 7th book, what comes next month, and I've published hundreds of recipes. And I'm such a creature of habit, so I've really had to go outside my comfort zone. But I mean, lasagnas and bowls and polentas and mushroom dishes. And my favorite recipes are, I made for, last night I made a spaghetti squash puttanesca and cream of mushroom cauliflower rice, and there's no limit to quiches and burritos and pizzas and flatbreads. And there's so many options. It's whatever you love to eat, you can make it whole food plant-based.
Well, we're recording approaching lunchtime, so I'm like, this sounds really good to me. Let me tell you for sure. Now, this sounds great. And again, if you are able to cook for yourself, obviously, and whatnot, create meals, it sounds pretty reasonable. The common guy out there listening is going to say, well, I don't have time to cook for myself. I'm out a lot. Is this a durable option where somebody can really incorporate it into a really busy lifestyle?
100%. And this is what I do with my clients too, is kind of teach them how to do this, because it takes it's much more complex than just a simple answer that I can give you right here. But I could say, like, if you throw together, I've got frozen brown rice packets I could throw in the microwave for 3 minutes. I could open up a can of beans, pour on some salsa, and add some bagged salad. It takes me 3 minutes, all of 3 minutes to make a delicious meal. Mm-hmm. There's, you could eat out, but there's no way to fully control meals in a restaurant. It's impossible. So the healthiest way to eat, no matter what your diet is, plant-based or omnivorous and anything in between, is to learn some basic cooking skills. What I do with my super busy clients, I'm a busy working mom. I like crazy busy. I had to teach myself all this too. Batch cooking like everyone has a day of the week or a couple hours in a week where they could just whip up a couple, like I'll make, 2 or 3 different, like 2 soups and a batch of hummus and a dressing and bake some potatoes. And you can just do this mad scientist in the kitchen thing for a couple hours, put on some music or a podcast, and it's actually really fun and relaxing. And you've got a week's worth of food. Then you get the bagged salad that you could just throw on, like instead of having to chop, there's a lot of choppage that goes on in a plant-based diet. You could avoid that. There's frozen vegetables and fruits are fabulous. There's always a way around it. And the more little simple skills you learn in the kitchen to make this doable for you, the easier and more nutritious and more sustainable it will be in the long run.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about outcomes. And what I mean by that. So first is in terms of expectations. Is a plant-based diet a nutritional option for just overall health? Or is it an option for weight loss, like if I want to lose 15 or 20 pounds, or both? How do you see it as a nutritional option?
I in 27 years in this industry, as a trainer and until now, I've yet to see something that is so across the board, a one size fits all option.
Mhm.
And the literature supports it. It's the most sustainable way to maintain a weight loss and to lose weight. I mean, there's many ways to lose weight. You could lose weight with cocaine or, just not eating. There's a million ways to lose
Not
weight.
recommended on this podcast.
Not recommended by any means. Right. Right. And then there are keto diet, whatever, but this is the healthiest way to do it. And that's why I recommend it.
And how, in terms of, if we focus on weight loss, just as a subset of benefit here, how soon would you notice weight loss on a diet like this, potentially?
My clients lose 0.5 to 0.8 pounds of body fat a day when I put them on the intensive program.
Wow.
It's so repeatable. And I can't even tell you, I have seen how this is so predictable. I know exactly why and how, or you can go slower and you can use 1 or 2 pounds a week. It just depends on where you're at and how motivated you are. But results are typical and they're predictable.
And sustainable.
That's the key. I get people off the roller coaster. That's what my book is. My subtitle of Choosing No Diet is Lose Weight for the Last Time, because the roller coaster that we're all on, I was on my entire life, it's awful emotionally. It's an emotional roller coaster. It's so devastating for so many people. And I want people to learn how to lose weight for the last time. And then the key is right then at the end is going into maintenance mode. And that's where I think that's my specialization, is getting them to maintenance so that it's for life and it's sustainable. And definitely a whole food plant-based diet is, I think, the most nutritious, healthiest way to do so.
Yeah, because that's the real big challenge, right? A lot of diets will say, yeah, I can lose 1, 2, 5 pounds a week. That's fantastic. But will I yo-yo right back in? But it sounds like you can use this plant-based diet for the long haul. So you're not bouncing back, basically.
Exactly.
And in terms of, you mentioned, I'm not sure if this is a fair question, but you mentioned the Mediterranean diet before. I mean, how are the benefits comparable? I don't know if they are, but like if you were to compare Mediterranean to plant-based, how would you, if you had to rate one versus the other, how would you compare them in terms of outcomes, in terms of benefits?
I literally wrote an entire book on this, a Vegiterranean diet, because I couldn't figure it out. And now I understand it very well. They're minuscule compared to a plant-based diet, minuscule. How are they still talking about Mediterranean diet being so healthy when we've actually reversed advanced stage cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes with the plant-based diet?
Right.
It's mind-blowing. It's not. Plus, the Mediterranean diet as we knew it is not what the Mediterranean diet is now. So it's meaningless. And all those people that they studied went back and their outcomes are not as good because they were just dousing olive oil. It's just, their studies are just so shockingly uncompelling when you really dig in and look at why. Yeah. And the plant-based just doesn't get it as much credit as it deserves.
That's fair enough. And you wrote a book about it. So you are a good source to compare that for sure. Because, Mediterranean always is kind of the darling of anything in the media about nutrition. Now, again, I'm the guy listening and I'm saying, okay, you got me. This sounds great. I love it. Where do I go from here? Because, there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things, right? So my first question is, how do you get started on the process like this? If I'm just listening to this podcast, I'm going to turn it off and now it's lunchtime. How do I get started?
I would say it always starts with informing yourself and getting some information. But it could also just start with a recipe. Like when I did this way back when, before Google and all that, I had to kind of figure out what do I eat? But now everything you want is at your fingertips. So if you love lasagna, Google whole food plant-based lasagna, and you will get lots of recipe options. Then you go, oh, this one sounds really good. Try it. If you love it, keep it in a pile. If you hate it, cross it off and move on to the next one. Start collecting recipes. Go on it on a fact-finding, fun-finding mission. Make this really positive. Think about what you're replacing. Find foods and recipes that you could replace. Again, you only need to find a good, maybe 12 recipes, maybe. Doesn't have to be perfect. And, make sure you're mindful of the nutrients. Of course, I recommend my books because I've got recipes and the nutrition and the supplements and everything you need to know. My first book, The Plant-Based Nutrition Idiot's Guide, kind of walks you through the whole process. But really go in it with a positive attitude of what am I going to add to my diet? Now, what am I cutting out?
Got it. Do you think a doctor needs to be involved in the process?
Well, I would never tell someone not to see their physician, especially if they've got any health conditions. I always support and recommend a healthcare professional to guide you.
And see, the problem is with doctors that a lot of them don't know a lot about this stuff, and it's just kind of like, okay, and my next patient's waiting. So, but you're right in the sense that, like, again, especially if you have medical conditions, right? Just to kind of keep that in mind, because they may be thinking of things that you as the individual may not. But you had mentioned cookbooks and whatnot. Can you recommend a few resources for individuals who maybe, what you said, first educate yourself, right? Well, this podcast is a good first step, right? They listened to and heard a lot of great information. Where do they go from here in terms of continuing that educational process?
Right, it's a great question. And if you go, first, if you go to my website, plantbaseddietitian.com, I have a whole section on resources, a whole page of resources. So I would suggest starting there. If you Google my last name, Hever, Hever, and plant-based diet healthcare professionals, I've written 2 peer-reviewed journal articles and the medical articles for healthcare professionals. So you could actually hand these to your physicians so they have some information if they're curious. But definitely, and you could read them too. Like I suggest that people read them as well, because they're referenced, and it's an overview of how and why a plant-based diet is effective and how to execute it. And then of course it's all referenced, so you can kind of dive in even deeper if you want to.
That sounds like fantastic, and we'll include the links on our YouTube channel, and then once we get it on the webpage as well, so the guys can have a reference to that. Julieanna, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic chat. I know I've learned a ton. I know my wife's going to be pushing rewind and listening over and over again. She loves this as well, and then she points me in the right direction. My last question to you has absolutely nothing to do with diet or nutrition, but you have you have the Wonder Woman mug, and it seems like it's fitting, right? You've done a lot with your life in a short period of time, in terms of writing books, in terms of being a professional, in terms of being a mom, and having a family. We call this podcast Better Man Clinics, right? Because the idea is just to get better in every which way. So my question to you is, what is the secret to your success? How do you live your best life?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for saying all of that. I don't know. I just wake up and I'm trying every day. Like, I'm so passionate about my work. I feel like that's what I live for. Like, I love being able to connect with people, and these magnificent transformations that I've seen every day. It just drives me. Like, I'm so excited about my work, and that every day I want to learn more and do as much as I can to, help inspire others to do the same.
Well, your passion is definitely palpable, and you are definitely an inspiration. Like I said, it's hearing all of this, I think, would inspire most guys to go out there and give it a try, which is really our goal here, right? Is just to get a little bit better. Julieanna, thank you so much for joining us. And to all of you guys out there watching and listening, thank you. And remember our mantra here at Better Man Clinics: your best life is a journey and not a destination, and use every day to get just a little bit better. We'll see you all next time.